Each day I'll do a golden deed, by helping those who are in need. My life on earth is but a span, and so I'll do the best I can.
Life's evening sun is sinking low, a few more days, and I must go
to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. To be a child of God each day, my light must shine along the way. I'll sing His praise while ages roll, and strive to help some troubled soul.
Life's evening sun is sinking low, a few more days, and I must go
to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. The only life that will endure is one that's kind and good and pure. And so for God, I'll take my stand. Each day I'll lend a helping hand.
Life's evening sun is sinking low, a few more days, and I must go to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. I'll help someone in time of need, and journey on with rapid speed. I'll help the sick and poor and weak, and words of kindness to them speak. Life's evening sun is sinking low, a few more days, and I must go to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. While going down life's weary road, I'll try to lift some traveler's load. I'll try to turn the night to day, make flowers bloom along the way. Life's evening sun is sinking low, a few more days, and I must go to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun.
I've heard people say such and such a book is my favorite New Testament book. Well, I don't know that I have a favorite book, but I do know this about 2 Corinthians. It is the most intimate of all Paul's epistles, because in 2 Corinthians he tells us much more about himself and about his feelings and his experiences than in any other place in the New Testament. In that 12th chapter that was partly read for us today, there are 6 words to which I want to draw your attention for a short time this morning. Years ago, when I was a small boy, I would see these 6 words on wall plaques in people's homes. It's old-fashioned nowadays to have text on your walls, or so it seems anyway. But that used to be quite popular among Christians, that have these coloured plaques, beautifully lettered or engraved in all kinds of colours. God is love, or something like that. Or this particular one, my grace is sufficient for you. It's there in that 12th chapter, isn't it? Perhaps you noticed that. And if you haven't seen that on somebody's wall in a home, go to any Bible bookshop even today, and I think you might even be able to find a wall plaque that says that. My grace is sufficient for thee. That second letter, chapter 12, is also interesting, because that's the chapter in which Paul tells us about this amazing experience that he once had, right at the very beginning, being caught up into the heaven of heavens, or the third heaven, and seeing things not lawful for a man to speak. It's said concerning, for example, Mrs. Helen G. White, that she claims to have been taken up into heaven, and being a woman, she had to talk about everything she saw. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But anyway, that's the story told about her. But Paul said, I couldn't speak about these things. It's also in that chapter, he speaks about this other experience that he had, to which I'm going to refer later. But I want you to think about those words for a short time today. My grace is sufficient for you. And I want to let you know where I'm going right at the very beginning, so you can see the direction I'm going to take. I'm going to suggest to you that no matter what the problem you have, no matter what burden you're bearing, what pain you may be suffering, because you are a child of God, you have at your disposal a strength, a sufficiency that the world doesn't possess and doesn't understand, because you are supplied by the grace of God. There's nothing can enter your life that you can't handle as a Christian because of the sufficiency of the grace of God. I'm going to call this sermon the all-sufficiency of God's grace. And when we look at those words, my grace is sufficient for you, they're not the words of Paul. If you look at verse 8, he says, he said to me. And if you look at verse 7, the verse before that, you'll find that he says, I prayed the Lord, and he said to me. So you're dealing here with the words of Jesus. This is a promise that the Lord himself gives to you. My grace is sufficient for you. And you think of the problem that Paul was facing at this time. In fact, a couple of problems as I see them here. He was talking about a prayer that he'd offered 3 times. And so far as he was concerned, he hadn't received the answer for which he was looking. 3 times. In fact, he says, 3 times. The emphasis is on the 3 times I besought the Lord. Not simply, I besought the Lord 3 times, but 3 times I besought the Lord. And he said, my grace is sufficient for you. What was the prayer about? Well, you know what it was about. It was about that thorn in the flesh. Well, I could take all my time up talking to you about Paul's thorn in the flesh and telling you what I think that it is. I won't be tempted to go down that road. It's a big temptation, but I'm going to control myself and not talk about the nature of Paul's thorn in the flesh, because for the simple reason, so far as the message is concerned, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter what it was, whether it was a physical disability or some internal problem that he had. We don't know really with certainty, but it doesn't really matter. We simply do know that he had this painful thing. In fact, the New English Bible calls it a sharp physical pain in the flesh. And the Apostle Paul, because he was an intelligent man, thought that he would be much more efficient in the work of the Lord and be a better Christian if he didn't have it. And consequently, he prayed about it, and he prayed 3 times. But he discovered, like many of us have discovered in the past, that God doesn't always answer our prayers in the way that we expect, or the way that we want. In this case, although Paul was an apostle, the prayer that he offered was not answered in the way that he was looking for. In fact, he actually is so desperate to be rid of this problem that he actually called it a messenger of Satan. He said, I've been given this thorn in the flesh, this painful experience, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted beyond measure. And if you read that rest of the chapter, I think it becomes evident that there were aspects to this thorn in the flesh that Paul didn't really understand, that he couldn't explain. And yet, in spite of everything, he knew one thing. He knew that God loved him. He knew that God cared about him, and that God was looking after him. Because he says, He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. I'll tell a little story. It just occurs to me to tell you this. It's nothing to do with the sermon, but I have on my shelves at home a book called Paul Thorne's Defense of Infant Baptism. It's a book published in the time of the great Charles Haddon Spurgeon, the great preacher in London. And this man Thorne had written this book. Not only a defense of infant baptism, but the subtitle is Infant Baptism, a Divine Obligation. And Spurgeon was actually in a London bookshop the day that this book was published. And there was an Anglican minister there who knew him. And he picked up a copy of the book and he said, there you are, Mr. Spurgeon, there's a thorn in the flesh for you Baptists. Spurgeon said, finish the quotation, a messenger of Satan, lest I be buffeted beyond measure. So that put an end to that conversation. But Paul says, my grace is sufficient for thee, is the message he received. Now, let's get down to practicalities here. We all have problems of one kind or another. And we all experience what Paul experienced here. Paul's experience was the experience of a prayer that had gone unanswered in the expected way. Is that an unusual experience? Have you never had that experience yourself? Have you never prayed for something and the prayer has not been answered in the way you wanted, or hoped for, or expected, or believed it should have happened? I think we all have, haven't we? And we've all got burdens to bear of one kind or another. In fact, if I were to ask this morning, and I'm not going to do it, so don't worry, everybody with a problem, everybody with an anxiety, everybody with a burden to carry, everyone with a pain were to stand up in this congregation, I think we'd be amazed at the tremendous variety of problems that exist in the lives of men and women. And I've no doubt that many of you have prayed about problems, haven't you? And if you haven't, you should have. You should have. But like Paul, you've not got the answer you've been expecting. Well, I'd like to remind you simply of this fact, that regardless of the response you've received, response or no response received, where God is concerned, even if your prayer is not answered in precisely the way you were looking for, He loves you, He's concerned about you, and His grace is still sufficient for you. In fact, I like the tense that Paul uses here. He uses the past perfect tense. Now, in the Authorized Version, the Revised Standard Version, and I've no doubt other versions as well, it's simply the past tense. He said to me. But here, Paul uses the past perfect tense. He has said to me. And that means he's not talking simply about something that God said in the past. He's talking about something God says today. He's talking about something God will still be saying in the future. Past, present, and future. He has said to me. It's an ongoing thing. It was true then in Paul's life. It is true today in your life, and it will be true in the lives of all who come after us who put their trust in Jesus Christ. God's grace was sufficient for Paul. It's sufficient for you. It's sufficient for every believer in the future. And not the thought that occurs to me. I'm glad I don't know exactly what it was that was wrong with Paul. I'm glad I don't know exactly what the thorn in the flesh was, and I'll tell you why. Because some folk who had a similar complaint might think that this was something special for them. And those of us who didn't have the same complaint might feel, well, there's not much here for me. It's even worse than that. If you knew exactly what Paul's thorn in the flesh might be, you might get some silly people inflicting themselves with the same kind of thorn just to show what great people they were. It happened in the past, didn't it? History is full of the cases of men and women, monks and nuns, who beat their bodies and inflicted all kinds of pain upon themselves and took upon themselves all kinds of burdens just to let other people see how holy they were. Now, Paul was not a masochist. He didn't like pain. He didn't look for pain. He didn't enjoy causing himself suffering to show how great he was. He was an intelligent human being. And he logically reasoned that if only he could get rid of this particular thorn in the flesh, whatever it was, he would be able to serve God better. And he might become a better Christian. And yet God said, no. My grace is sufficient for you. You know, I know it's not always easy to see what purpose God has in the problems that come into your life. It's not easy to bear the burdens that are placed upon you, or the sorrow that enters your life, the pain you have to bear. And it's not always easy to see God's purpose in these experiences. But there is a purpose. You know, in his first letter, Paul laid down a principle. He said, God will not allow you to be tempted above what you're able to bear, but will with the temptation provide a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. Not an escape from it, by the way, but through it. So that's the principle that he lays down in his first letter, chapter 10. Good. He will not cause you to suffer more than beyond your ability to bear. And then in his second letter, this 12th chapter, you have the demonstration. He said, I prayed to God 3 times. I prayed to him to ask that the thorn might be removed. But he said, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect, or reaches its fulfillment, achieves its goal, is what the word means in your suffering. So Paul says, yes, that's the principle, and I know because I proved it. And it works out like that very often. You know, God can work through the pain that's inflicted in your life. He can work through the experiences you have, providing you live as a Christian. I can say this because Isabel's not here today. When she was lying in the hospital in Paisley, there was one staff nurse who was a particularly, or seemed to me at the beginning, a rather obnoxious lady. In fact, at one time, when Susan was suffering so badly, she actually told her, she says, I think you're an ogre. we laugh at it now, and we laughed at it after. But she was a very difficult ward staff nurse. But before we left, but the last week that Isabel was in hospital, after 7 months, she came. She said, Mr. Morgan, I want to tell you something. She said, I'm going back to church on Sunday. I'm taking my family with me. And she said, I want you to know it's because of you and your wife that I'm doing this. Now, I will say that initially, when she knew that we were Christians right at the very beginning, I had given her some literature to read to explain precisely who we are, what we believe. I don't even know today whether or not she read the literature, but at least she made a point of coming. I said, well, will you tell Isabel that? So she actually went to Isabel and told her the very same thing. Because of your example, that I'm going back to church on Sunday, taking my family with me. I learned a little later that she had been a regular churchgoer, but her father had died suddenly, and the experience had been such a shock to her that she'd rebelled against God. You know, people do that, don't they? And she hadn't gone to church. So now, you'd be surprised what people can see in your life if you're trying to live as a Christian. You'd be surprised the extent and the depth of the influence your life can have on other people if you seek to live in a way that's pleasing to God, and if you rely in your life upon the abundance of the grace of God. There's a story that I came across a long time ago now, but it's a true story. There's a young lady who was suffering from a very severe ailment, an incurable ailment, a very painful ailment. And a gentleman went to visit her, and he took one of those little books of comfort. You know, there's some devotional booklets that you often take along to sick people, to give them encouragement, to help them. And he presented her with this book. He said, I hope you might find this useful. And she looked at the book and she said, "Oh, I know that book." "Oh," he said, "have you read it?" She said, "I wrote it." I can remember a case in what is Kirkby in Ashfield. It used to be called East Kirkby. Kirkby in Ashfield. There's one young lady there who was suffering from a serious illness. In fact, a fatal illness. She later died. And it was a joy to go to visit her. You know, you go thinking you're going to encourage somebody, and you come back feeling blessed yourself. That was one of those cases. You went into her presence, and the smile was there, the upbeat spirit was there, and you came away feeling that you had really been in the presence of a true Christian who was suffering. In spite of handicaps, in spite of burdens, in spite of problems in your life, God blesses you. These can be blessings in disguise, for the simple reason that when you've got thorns thrust into you, when you have limitations imposed on you, you can often do your very best work for God, because they make you more dependent on Him. Now that's what Paul meant when he said, "Therefore I will rejoice in my weaknesses," because he saw the glory going to God. Did Paul really experience the grace of God in his life? Well, let me read you some passages here. Listen to what one translation has of 2 Corinthians. After speaking of the transcendent power belonging to God, Paul says, "We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed." Now listen to the same passage in the New English Bible. "Hard pressed on every side, but never hemmed in. Bewildered, but never at our wits' end. Hunted, but never abandoned to our fate. Struck down, but never left to die." And here's the Good News version. "We're often troubled, but not crushed. Sometimes in doubt, but never in despair. There are many enemies, but we're never without a friend. And although badly hurt at times, we're not destroyed." Here's another one. "We're pressed on every side by troubles, but not crushed and broken. We're perplexed because we don't know why things happen as they do, but we don't give up and quit. We're hunted down, but God never abandons us. We get knocked down, but then we get up again and keep going." That's the Living New Testament. And I've got to tell you, there's one, I've got about 37 versions, but there's one more here. "We are knocked down, but never knocked out. And I like that. We're knocked down, but never knocked out. And that's why he could say to Timothy in his second letter, chapter 1, verses 3 to 11, he said, you remember the sufferings I experienced at Lystra and Derbe and Iconium. Out of them all the Lord delivered me. Now, if you go back to Acts 14 and you read what happened to Paul at Lystra, you'll be amazed. Because at Lystra, he's stoned and dragged out of the city and left for dead. And the brethren actually believed that he died. And yet he sort of slips over that and he simply says, at Lystra, the persecutions I had, out of them all the Lord delivered me. That's a tremendous faith. Tremendous faith. And I would suggest to you today that if we will try to live by this motto, my grace is sufficient for you, we shall discover that whatever we have to face in sickness, in pressures, in problems, in temptations, in trials, whatever thorn in the flesh we might find ourselves experiencing, the Lord says to you, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is revealed in your weakness. There's a little motto that we sometimes hear, which I think sums it up in a nutshell. Man's extremity is God's opportunity. When you're at your weakness and at your weakest, God's strength has barely begun to work. My grace is sufficient for you. Let's live by that passage.
God sent his Son, they called him Jesus. He came to love, heal and forgive. He lived and died to buy my pardon. An empty grave is there to prove my Savior lives. Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because I know he holds the future, and life is worth the living just because he lives. How sweet to hold a newborn baby and feel the pride and joy he gives. But greater still, the calm assurance this child can face uncertain days because he lives. Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because I know he holds the future, and life is worth the living just because he lives. And then one day I'll cross the river, I'll fight life's final war with pain. death gives way to victory, I'll see the lights of glory, and I'll know He lives. Because He lives, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, all fear is gone. Because I know He holds the future, and life is worth a living just because He lives. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And I love that old cross where the dearest and best for a world of lost sinners was slain. So I'll cherish the cross, the old rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the cross, the old rugged cross, and exchange it someday for a crown. Oh, that old rugged cross, so despised by the world, has a wondrous attraction for me. For the dear Lamb of God left His glory above to bear it to dark Calvary. So I'll cherish the cross, the old rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the cross, the old rugged cross, and exchange it someday for a crown. In that old rugged cross, stained with blood so divine, a wondrous beauty I see. For 'twas on that old cross Jesus suffered and died to pardon and sanctify me. So I'll cherish the cross, the old rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the cross, the old rugged cross, and exchange it someday for a crown. To that old rugged cross I will ever be true, its shame and reproach gladly bear. Then He'll call me someday to my home far away, where His glory forever I'll share. So I'll cherish the cross, the old rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the cross, the old someday for a crown.